Hey boys and girls, it's Miss Caldwell. So here we are for chapter 20. This is the last chapter of the Landry News by Andrew Clements. This is where we really tie in all of our thoughts, all of our guesses, our predictions. We tie in everything we know about all the characters to see how our story ends. Alright, chapter 20, Home Team Goes for Broke. Shortly before 7:30 on a Tuesday night in December, Mr. Larson straightened his necktie, kissed his wife, then turned to walk down the sloped aisle of the high school auditorium. A row of folding tables had been set up in front of the auditorium stage. After he sat down across from Dr. Barnes at the first table, Mr. Larson turned his head and looked out into the audience. It looked to him like there were at least 400 people in the room. His wife had settled near the back and was smiling at him, all warmth and support. The kids from his class were scattered all over the place, sitting with one or both of their parents. Carol and her mother were in the fourth row, and when he looked at them, Kara gave him a nervous smile and waved shyly. Mr. Larson felt self-conscious up there at the front of the hall, but he did not feel alone. There was something that Mr. Larson had not discussed with the kids in his class. It was entirely possible that the freedom of the press would win its battle and that he would still lose his job. True, public opinion mattered. Newspaper reporters and camera crews from 2 of the 3 major TV stations were here. But at the end of the night, it would all depend on how the school board voted. Mr. Larson knew that out of the 7 members, 3 would love to see him leave, and 2 others were not very fond of him. It was going to be an uphill battle. At exactly 7:30, the superintendent called the meeting to order. The school board president, Mrs. Diopoulos, read the call to meeting notice and then introduced Dr. Barnes. Since it was Dr. Barnes who had brought the complaint, he was required to speak first. Madam President, he began, on Friday, December 7th, I read the newest edition of this student newspaper and found a story about divorce that I did not think was appropriate. As you know, I immediately brought the article to the attention of the board and the superintendent. You apparently agreed that the content was not appropriate, and since Mr. Larson had accepted responsibility for the contents of the paper, you agreed that this disciplinary hearing was needed. Madam President, will you please explain to those present what the board found to be inappropriate in the story? As Dr. Barnes sat down, Mrs. Diopoulos leaned closer to her microphone and said, Yes, Dr. Barnes. We found that the subject matter and the description of the boy's suffering was too personal, and that the topic of divorce is too mature a theme to be treated in this way in an elementary school newspaper. The board feels that by allowing this to be published, Mr. Larson made a very serious error in judgment. In light of past complaints about Mr. Larson's abilities and practices as a classroom teacher, we agreed that this hearing was necessary. Turning to Mr. Larson, Mrs. Diopoulos asked, Mr. Larson, do you have a lawyer present, or will you be speaking for yourself? Mr. Larson stood up stiffly, talking into a handheld microphone. I will be speaking for myself, Madam President. Stepping away from the table, Mr. Larson addressed the board members. I see this issue of the story in the Landry News in very simple terms. Yes, Dr. Barnes made me responsible for the content of the paper, and I passed that responsibility on to the students. It is true that Dr. Barnes asked to see each copy of the newspaper before it was printed, and I refused that request. But Dr. Barnes did not insist on previewing each paper, which, as principal, he could have. Instead, he left the responsibility with me. He gave me no guidelines about what topics were not appropriate, nor does the school board have any clear policies regarding school newspapers. According to the Hazelwood Supreme Court decision, a school board must have a clear set of policies in force in order to censor a school newspaper. Mr. Larson paused and looked around at Dr. Barnes. So, as I see it, I am being accused of allowing something to happen that no one ever informed me I should not have allowed to happen in the first place. Either that, or the real issue here is those past complaints about my teaching practices that Madam President has mentioned. Mr. Larson walked back to his place, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a copy of the article. As part of my statement, I would like to read out loud the entire story from the newspaper so that all present and all those watching at home on the town cable TV channel can judge for themselves its appropriateness or inappropriateness. The board members began hurriedly whispering among themselves, their hands cupped over their microphones. The whispering stopped, and Mrs. Diopoulos said, "Since it is part of your defense, you have the right to read the story into the record, Mr. Larson." A woman in the 6th row immediately stood up and raised her hand. Mrs. Diopoulos nodded to her, and a Boy Scout trotted over with another portable microphone. "Thank you, Madam President. My name is Allie Morton, and my son Michael has asked if he may read the story aloud. He's the boy who wrote it, and it's about the divorce our family went through last year." Almost everyone in the auditorium seemed to gasp at once, but Kara Landry didn't gasp. She had known this was coming. She had called Michael a week ago to ask him to read his story at the meeting. She told him it would help Mr. Larson if people could see that this was a true story. At first, Michael said no. He thought he would be too scared. But after he talked it over with his mom, he called Kara back and said he would do it for Mr. Larson. Kara sat up on the edge of her seat to see what would happen. After another hurried conference among the board, it was agreed that Michael Morton could read his own words aloud for the record. He squeezed his way past knees and seat backs in the 6th row and walked down the aisle to where Mr. Larson stood. Mr. Larson handed Michael the story and held the microphone for him. Michael brushed the mop of brown hair out of his eyes, looked once at his mom in the 6th row, and then at Kara Landry in the 4th row. He focused on the page, gulped, and began to read, squinting because of the bright light held up by the TV camera crews. Lost and found. When I heard that my parents were getting divorced, the first thing I did was run to my room, grab my baseball bat, and pound all my Little League trophies into bits. I felt like I wanted to run away. I have a lot of friends who have divorced parents, but I never thought it would happen in my family. I felt like I was lost. This was going to ruin everything. My mom told me that my dad was going to move out and live somewhere else. She kept saying things like, "Don't worry, and everything will be all right," and things like this just happen. And she said that I would still get to see my dad and that I could talk to him whenever I wanted to. I didn't believe her. My dad took me out to a restaurant. He wanted to talk to me. He said I wouldn't understand, but that he just didn't love my mom anymore. He was right. That was the part I couldn't understand. I mean, sometimes I yell, "I hate you" at my mom and dad, and my dad, and I couldn't sometimes I yell, "I hate you" at my mom and dad, and some days I feel like I hate everybody, but I don't really, and pretty soon everything's okay again. I know I could never stop loving my dad, and I could never stop loving mom either, so I couldn't see how my dad could stop loving her. And I thought that if my dad could stop loving mom, then he could probably stop loving me too. When Dad went to pay for the food, I ran out of the restaurant and hid in the bushes by the parking lot. I saw him come outside and look for me, and he was yelling my name, and he was really scared and worried, and I was glad. I watched until my dad got in the car and used his telephone, and then he drove off toward our house really fast. I walked over to my friend Josh's house, but he wasn't home. Then I just walked and walked. It was way after dark when I got home. There was a police car in front of my house, and when I walked in, my mom ran over to hug me, but I wouldn't let her. My dad said I was in big trouble and that I was grounded, but I just said, "How are you going to ground me? You're not even going to be here to see anything I do." Then I went to my room and slammed the door as hard as I could. That was about a year ago. My dad did move out, and now he's already married again. I never did really run away, not even for an afternoon, but I used to cry a lot late at night. I know some kids will think that's a sissy thing, but I couldn't help it. And one day my mom was late getting home from work, and there wasn't a message, and there was no answer at her office, and I got so scared, and I ran to her room to look in her closet to see if her dresses were still there. It was stupid, but I was afraid that maybe she had moved out too. Sometimes I'm not as happy as I used to be, but I try not to show it. I think my mom is happier now, but if I get unhappy, it ruins things for her, and then it's hard for both of us. Things aren't so bad now, just different. I found out that my mom told the truth back at the beginning, because everything is mostly all right. And when she said things like this just happen, that was right too. Now I know that something like this can just happen because it happened to me. And I also found out that my dad still loves me. And I even know that he still loves Mom, only not in a married way. It's not that I see him a lot or anything, because I don't. He's not with me every day or at bedtimes except one weekend a month. But I know he still loves me. I just know it, and sometimes just knowing something has to be enough. When Michael finished reading, people all around the auditorium were fishing around for tissues and handkerchiefs. There was a spontaneous burst of applause, and he made his way back to his seat. After Michael sat down, his mom put her arm around his shoulders and squeezed. When it was quiet again, Mr. Larson said, "Thank you, Michael." Then he held up the story Michael had just read and said, "How could someone say that this is not appropriate content for elementary school children to read and think about? Parents and others who have very good motives, people like Dr. Barnes and all of us who only want the best for children, we may not like to admit that things like divorce create very real problems for children, but they do. And if children are honest enough to admit that, why can't we? My teaching style is unconventional, and Dr. Barnes and I have disagreed about that since he arrived here 7 years ago. Could I have been a better teacher during that time? Yes, I admit that. But what has happened with this newspaper, and that includes allowing this story to be published, is some of the best work I have done in all my 19 years as a teacher. If I am to be fired, please let it be for something other than this. Everyone, even Dr. Barnes, knows that in an auditorium with 400 people on their feet and cheering, with the TV cameras rolling and the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, it's not a good idea to fire the person the crowd is applauding. In less than a minute, while the audience was still clapping and cheering, Mrs. Diopoulos took a quick poll of the school board and announced for the record that the disciplinary action against Mr. Carl Larson, teacher, was dismissed. Kara Landry had done as Mr. Larson asked and stopped publishing the Landry News. But even though the Guardian had kept her busy, Kara had not stopped writing the Landry News, and she had not stopped printing it. As the crowd began to leave, Kara stayed in her seat in the fourth row and turned to watch. Joey and Ed stood at the doors on the north side of the auditorium. Leanne and Sharon took the 2 doors at the south side. They were handing out a special edition of the Landry News. Kara reached into her coat, pulled out a copy, and carried it down to Mr. Larson, who was surrounded by reporters. He stopped mid-sentence when Kara put it into his hand and looked from the paper to Kara's face and then back to the paper. Kara stood to one side and watched quietly as he read the whole thing. The special edition was only